From the moment we are born, the world begins to leave invisible marks on us. Without realizing it, we absorb more than words and gestures. We absorb expectations, judgments, and norms that dictate how we should live, how we should feel, and who we should be. This process begins before we can even speak, and even more surprising, it continues to shape us throughout our lives. But what happens to the parts of us that don't fit this mold? Where do those desires, emotions, and thoughts that don't fit external expectations go? That's where the shadow begins, a powerful and often underestimated force. The way our environment shapes our psyche can be a source of deep internal conflict. The invisible rules we absorb can be in conflict with our true essence, creating fragmentation and disconnection. But what we're not taught is that in order to live fully and authentically, we must learn to integrate those repressed parts of ourselves. Understanding how our shadow influences our life can be the first step towards real and profound transformation. My name is Cosmin, and I have spent years helping people to deepen their self-knowledge and find the inner clarity they so crave. Through audiobooks, several ebooks I have written, and my personal experience, I have guided hundreds of people to face and understand their shadow, to reconcile with those repressed parts, and ultimately to find peace and balance in their lives. This video isn't for everyone. If you're looking for quick fixes or superficial answers, it's probably not for you. But if you're someone who feels stuck in repetitive patterns, who feels like there's something deeper inside you that's seeking to be heard, then I invite you to stick around until the end. You'll discover how facing your shadow can unlock a more authentic, liberated version of yourself, a version you may not have even known existed. Our family environment provides us with our first maps for navigating the world. But beyond the walls of our home, the society we are born into also begins to influence us, often in ways we do not fully understand until much later. We absorb beliefs about right and wrong, about what behaviors are worthy of approval, and what will make us face judgment from others. These teachings, though not always expressed explicitly, are there like a silent current guiding our decisions and our ways of acting. As we grow up, this process becomes even deeper and more complex. Without realizing it, we begin to adjust our emotions, our responses, our opinions, all in an attempt, often unconscious, to fit into the molds that others have designed for us. The importance of this process cannot be underestimated, as it determines the way we see ourselves and, therefore, how we relate to the world around us. By conforming to external expectations, we begin to build our identity based on what others expect of us, rather than exploring who we truly are on the inside. This inevitably creates a distance between our most authentic essence and the mask we begin to use to navigate the social world. Without realizing it, we begin to live lives that, while perhaps acceptable from the outside, may not fully reflect our inner truth. As we grow older, this adaptation becomes more and more profound. Almost imperceptibly, we begin to absorb the expectations that others have of us. We conform to what we perceive as necessary in order to obtain acceptance, belonging, and love, the three fundamental pillars that sustain our human interactions from an early age. However, this early adaptation is not neutral or without consequences. It comes at a significant cost, a price we pay by splitting our psyche and classifying certain parts of ourselves as good and others as bad. We are forced to separate those qualities and emotions that are accepted and appreciated by society from those that are labeled as inadequate or inappropriate. This process is the beginning of what Carl Jung described as the shadow, a fundamental concept in his theory of analytical psychology that refers to all those aspects of our personality that we have repressed or rejected. As childhood turns into adolescence and then into adulthood, our tendency to conform to other people's expectations becomes an increasingly automated process. We do it without thinking, like second nature. Sometimes we're not even aware that we're constantly adjusting our personality, our emotions, and even our dreams based on what we think will guarantee us acceptance and belonging. These are two of the most fundamental pillars in our human relationships. And from an early age, we learn that love and acceptance aren't always unconditional. Often, they're rewards we get when we behave in a certain way or adhere to certain values or norms imposed on us. However, this adaptation, while necessary to navigate the social world, is not without consequences. With every adjustment we make, we are dividing our being into acceptable parts and parts we consider inappropriate. Perhaps without realizing it, we are categorizing our emotions and qualities in terms of what is socially desirable and what is not. Anger, for example, may be seen as an inappropriate feeling. Sadness may be considered a sign of weakness. So, we learn to repress these emotions, to bury them deep within our psyche. This process, which Carl Jung brilliantly described as the formation of the shadow, is a form of self-protection that allows us to survive in a world that imposes restrictions and expectations on us from a very early age. What we often don't realize is that this internal split comes at a significant cost. By labeling certain aspects of ourselves as unacceptable, we relegate them to the unconscious, where they don't go away, but instead wait for their moment to manifest in ways we can't always foresee. This process of repression creates a kind of internal fracture, where important parts of our psyche become separated from our conscious identity. Although it may seem like we've controlled or overcome these emotions or qualities, in reality, what we've done is bury them deeper, where they continue to exert their influence in subterranean and often destructive ways. The shadow, according to Jung, is nothing more than a reflection of all those parts of ourselves that do not fit into the socially accepted mold that we have internalized. Those aspects of our personality that, from an early age, we have learned to hide because they do not meet the norms or expectations of those around us. This process of splitting the psyche is subtle, but incredibly powerful and determining. From a very young age, we begin to experience intense and natural emotions such as anger, fear, sadness, or confusion. But we are met with external responses that suggest that these emotions are not desirable or accepted. Perhaps we were told phrases such as "don't cry," "don't be weak," "big boys are not afraid," or "don't be angry, it's not that bad." These phrases, which may often seem harmless or even well-intentioned, actually act as small bricks that build a wall inside us. This wall not only separates us from our emotions, but also begins to fragment our psyche, dividing it between what is allowed and what is repressed. The shadow, as Jung describes it, is a concept that invites us to look deep within ourselves to understand how and why we repress certain aspects of our personality. These repressed parts are not inherently bad or defective. They simply do not fit the mold we have internalized of what we should be. From a very young age, we learn that certain emotions or behaviors are not welcome in society, and so we begin to hide them away. These repressed aspects of our personality make up what Jung called the shadow, a dark and often hidden part of our psyche that continues to influence our lives, even if we are not always aware of it. From childhood, when we feel intense emotions like anger or fear, our first reactions may be to external disapproval. Phrases like "don't cry" or "don't get angry" seem harmless at first, but what they really do is tell us that there is something wrong with feeling what we are feeling. So, every time we repress a natural emotion, we build a brick in the wall that will eventually become our shadow. Over time, this wall becomes higher and more impenetrable, separating us from the emotions we have learned to hide. This process is incredibly powerful because even if we don't consciously know it, we are dividing our psyche into two parts: the visible and accepted part, and the hidden and repressed part. While this allows us to function within societal expectations, it also creates an internal divide that has profound effects on our emotional and psychological lives. This wall we build within ourselves not only separates us from our emotions, but it also limits our ability to be authentic and truly connect with others. The shadow, although hidden, is still present, and the longer we go without acknowledging it, the more power it gains in our lives. Often, it is not just what we are told directly, but also the attitudes we implicitly perceive in others. Disapproving glances, awkward gestures, or emotional withdrawal from loved ones when we show vulnerability are subtle but powerful signals that something is not right with us, that there are parts of our personality that are not welcome. These messages reinforce the idea that certain emotions or behaviors must be eliminated from our identity. We begin to associate these parts of ourselves with something negative, with something that must be hidden if we want to be accepted and loved by those around us. Human communication is a complex dance of words, gestures, and silences, and it is often in what is left unsaid that we find the most powerful messages. From an early age, we not only receive direct instructions about what is allowed or forbidden, but we also learn to read between the lines. A disapproving sigh when we show vulnerability, an uncomfortable look when we express anger, or an emotional withdrawal when we share our fear are signals that are not expressed openly, but which have a deep and lasting impact on our psyche. These silent signals are imprinted on us in ways we rarely understand at the time, but over time, they become the guides we follow to adapt our behavior. This kind of implicit feedback, which is rarely discussed openly, has a corrosive effect on our relationship with ourselves. Without words, we learn that certain parts of our personality are not welcome in the spaces we inhabit, and so we instinctively begin to push them away. This is not a conscious process, but a natural reaction to the need to fit in and be accepted. Repeatedly experiencing these subtle cues reinforces the idea that some of our emotions, thoughts, or behaviors are inherently unacceptable. We then begin to see those parts of ourselves not just as inconvenient, but as aspects that we must repress if we wish to be loved and valued by those around us. Over time, this adaptation not only leads us to hide certain emotions or behaviors, but it also conditions our self-perception. We begin to associate those repressed aspects of ourselves with something intrinsically negative. Our identity becomes divided, and the parts we consider acceptable become the facade we show to the world, while the parts we have chosen to hide become shadows we prefer not to acknowledge. This process of repression is particularly painful because, at its core, is the fear of not being loved. The underlying belief is that, in order to deserve love and acceptance, we must get rid of that which could be judged or rejected. However, this act of hiding separates us more and more from our essence, and the emotions we have buried, far from disappearing, begin to accumulate in the darkness, waiting for the moment to come to the surface. So, we learn to hide those aspects, to bury them deep in the darkest corners of our psyche. This process of repression is not a conscious decision, but a natural response to the innate desire to be accepted within the group. From an evolutionary perspective, it makes perfect sense. We are social creatures, and survival, from our earliest days in this world, depends heavily on our ability to stay within the boundaries of what our community deems acceptable. Being rejected or expelled from the group, in our primitive minds, is perceived as a direct threat to our survival. So, we adjust our behavior, our emotions, and even our beliefs, all for the purpose of fitting in and being accepted. Burying parts of ourselves is not something we choose to do deliberately, but rather a survival strategy that stems from deep within our social nature. Throughout human history, acceptance within the group has been essential to our survival. In primitive societies, being rejected by the tribe meant facing the dangers of the world without collective support, a situation that was often synonymous with death. This fundamental need to belong has been etched into our biology and psychology. And although we do not face the same kind of physical threats today, the fear of social rejection remains just as powerful and motivating. In our unconscious, rejection translates into danger. And so, from an early age, we begin to adjust who we are to ensure that we will be accepted. This adaptation process is instinctive. To stay within the boundaries of what our community deems acceptable, we learn to hide what might jeopardize our belonging. We conform to the group's implicit rules, adjusting our emotions, behaviors, and even our beliefs to avoid rejection. This desire to be accepted is so deep that we often don't even realize we're repressing fundamental aspects of ourselves. In our eagerness to fit in, we begin to distort our authenticity, building layers of personality that, while protecting us from outside judgment, distance us further and further from our true essence. The cost of this adaptation, while it provides us with security in the short term, is a progressive disconnection from our own identity. What is supposed to be an act of self-protection ends up creating an internal divide between what we show to the world and who we really are. It is ironic, because although we do this to be accepted and loved, in doing so, we begin to lose touch with the parts of ourselves that most need to be seen and acknowledged. And while these parts remain buried, we become increasingly fragmented, removed not only from our own essence, but also from the possibility of establishing authentic relationships with others. However, what we are not taught in this process of social adaptation is that those repressed parts of ourselves do not simply disappear because we have ignored them. It is not so easy to get rid of fundamental aspects of our psyche. In fact, the more we repress these aspects, the stronger they become. Those emotions, desires, or behaviors that we have decided to bury in our unconscious continue to exist, albeit out of our conscious view, and they begin to look for ways to manifest themselves. And often, when they finally emerge, they do so in destructive or uncontrolled ways because we have not given them a safe and conscious space to express themselves. The great misunderstanding in this adaptation process is the belief that we can somehow get rid of the parts of ourselves that don't fit into societal norms. We are not taught that those emotions, desires, or impulses we try to repress don't just go away because we ignore them. Unlike a physical object that can be discarded, the repressed parts of our psyche cannot be eliminated. They remain alive, albeit hidden, in the unconscious. There, in the dark, these parts continue to exert an influence on us, albeit in ways we don't always understand. The more we try to repress them, the stronger they become, accumulating energy, waiting for their moment to emerge. When they finally do, their manifestation can be devastating. What we have buried for so long in our psyche desperately seeks an outlet, but without a proper space to express itself, these repressed parts emerge in a chaotic or destructive manner. This can take the form of emotional outbursts that seem disproportionate to the current situation, self-destructive behaviors, or decisions that go against our own interests. These manifestations are, in fact, the clamor of those repressed parts of our psyche, demanding to be seen, heard, and acknowledged. It is as if everything we have tried to keep under control for so long explodes all at once, without us being able to fully understand why we feel or act the way we do. The fact that these repressed parts seek ways to manifest themselves reminds us that we cannot simply ignore what we don't like about ourselves. By trying to eliminate fundamental aspects of our psyche, what we are really doing is strengthening their power in the dark. Eventually, these aspects will find a way to come to light. But if we have not consciously acknowledged them, their emergence will be unpredictable and often destructive. Instead of solving the problem by repressing our emotions or desires, we only postpone the inevitable, building up an internal pressure that, when finally released, can have devastating consequences on our lives and relationships. This cycle of repression and explosion is unsustainable. We delude ourselves into thinking that we can bury parts of ourselves and continue to function in a balanced way. The truth is that every aspect of our psyche, no matter how uncomfortable, seeks recognition and expression. If we don't give them a conscious and safe space, these repressed parts will continue to seek their way out in ways we can't always control or predict. Only when we stop repressing and begin to confront what we've tried to ignore can we begin to live more fully and authentically without the constant threat of what's repressed emerging in destructive ways. The process of repression is deceptive, as it can give us the illusion of control. We think that by burying our emotions or unwanted aspects of our personality, we are solving the problem, when in reality, we are only postponing the moment when those aspects will seek to surface. These repressed parts do not disappear simply by ignoring them. They are still there, waiting for an opportunity to manifest. This repression generates an internal pressure that builds up over time. And when it is finally released, it does so with an intensity that can be surprising and even frightening. Manifestations of the shadow may appear in the form of unexplained outbursts of anger, self-destructive patterns of behavior, or feelings of deep discomfort in situations that, objectively, should not be so conflictive. The process of repression acts as a psychological mirage. It gives us a false sense of control, a superficial calm that leads us to believe that by ignoring or burying certain emotions, we have managed to effectively manage them. It is a temporary relief that allows us to continue with our lives without facing those uncomfortable aspects of our personality, which at the time seem to be neutralized. We feel, however wrongly, that we have overcome these internal conflicts, that we have tamed our darkest impulses. This control seems liberating, allowing us to function, relate, and move on. But in reality, this is all an illusion. These repressed parts of our psyche don't just dissolve into oblivion because we ignore them. Even if the more uncomfortable aspects of our shadow seem to be under control, they live on in the unconscious, waiting for their chance to emerge. It's as if we're putting lids on cauldrons that continue to simmer beneath the surface. The pressure continues to build, invisibly, until suddenly, something seemingly trivial causes those lids to pop off. That's when we experience emotional outbursts that seem out of proportion, like inexplicable rage over a minor situation or deep sadness triggered by a minor event. What's really happening is that the repressed emotions have found a crack through which to escape, breaking out in an intense and uncontrolled manner, precisely because they've been ignored for so long. This prolonged repression can also manifest itself in self-destructive patterns. Often, without understanding why, we find ourselves sabotaging our own opportunities, our relationships, or even our health. These behaviors are not the result of a simple lack of self-control, but rather the result of years of ignoring those parts of ourselves that are now seeking to be acknowledged in any way possible. It is important to understand that these emotional outbursts or destructive behaviors do not come out of nowhere. They are the culmination of internal pressure built up over time, pressure that has been quietly building up in the depths of our psyche as we continued to deny its existence. Moreover, this release of repressed energy does not always present itself in a violent or dramatic way. Sometimes it manifests as a feeling of deep unease, a discomfort that seems to have no direct cause in the present. We may experience unexplainable anxiety or feel trapped in a cycle of dissatisfaction that seems to have no end. The disconcerting thing about these experiences is that often external situations are not objectively problematic, but something inside us reacts as if they were. What we are actually feeling is the echo of those repressed emotions, desperately seeking to be processed and acknowledged. The real paradox of repression is that while it seems like a viable and effective solution in the short term, in the long term it only makes problems worse. The shadow doesn't go away or weaken when we bury it. It grows stronger in silence. And when it finally emerges, it does so with a force that can be terrifying precisely because it has been ignored for so long. We are faced with a torrent of emotions or behaviors that seem to come out of nowhere, but are actually the result of years of suppression. This is the cost of the self-deception we perpetuate when we try to control the uncontrollable. Repression is not a solution. It is simply a strategy of postponement that, sooner or later, requires us to confront that which we have tried to hide. The fact that the shadow grows stronger the more we try to ignore it is a reminder that we cannot simply get rid of parts of our psyche. The shadow feeds on our repression, grows stronger in the darkness of the unconscious, and if we do not confront it consciously, it can end up exerting considerable control over our lives. The more we repress these aspects of ourselves, the stronger they become in their attempt to manifest themselves, seeking ways, sometimes indirect or irrational, to come to light. Ultimately, the shadow wants to be acknowledged, not destroyed, because it contains an important part of our identity. The shadow is not an enemy that can be destroyed, nor an obstacle that can simply be removed. It is an integral part of our psyche, a collection of aspects that for one reason or another, we have learned to reject or suppress. What we often fail to understand is that the shadow does not want to be ignored, and the more we try to push it away, the more energy it accumulates. This is the great paradox of repression. The harder we try to bury certain parts of ourselves, the more powerful they become. The shadow does not disappear when we relegate it to the unconscious. Rather, it grows stronger in the darkness, where it acts subversively and indirectly, affecting our decisions, our relationships, and our emotional well-being. Every time we deny a part of ourselves, we are, in essence, giving more power to the shadow. The more we repress our emotions, desires, or impulses, the more desperately they seek an outlet, even if it is through irrational or destructive means. These parts of ourselves, even if we do not want to face them, still exist. Ignoring them is not a solution, because the shadow will not go away simply because we have ignored it. On the contrary, as it is repressed, it becomes increasingly cunning in its attempt to manifest itself. It may appear in unexpected ways, such as a sudden feeling of unease, a decision that sabotages our own goals, or an emotional reaction that seems completely out of place. The shadow finds ways to make itself present because ultimately, its goal is not our destruction, but our integration. This is a crucial point to understand. The shadow is not a malevolent force out to harm us. On the contrary, it is a vital part of our identity that has been relegated to oblivion because it did not fit with external expectations. But it is still a part of us, and its purpose is to be acknowledged and integrated into our conscious psyche. When we understand this, we can begin to change our relationship with the shadow. Instead of seeing it as a threat, we can begin to see it as an ally in our process of personal growth. The shadow does not want to dominate us. It wants to be accepted. It wants us to stop ignoring it and start recognizing it as a legitimate part of who we are. This process of integration is fundamental to our emotional and psychological well-being. Only when we stop fighting the shadow and start working with it can we free ourselves from the cycle of repression and explosion that has marked so much of our life. By consciously facing the shadow, we give it space in our life, which reduces its destructive power. Instead of continuing to repress our emotions and desires, we learn to accept them as valid parts of our identity. And by doing this, we not only free ourselves from the burden of repression, but we also begin to reclaim parts of ourselves that we had lost in the process. The shadow is not something that needs to be eliminated. It is something that needs to be embraced and integrated, because only then can we live authentically and fully. It is important to understand that the process of repression and shadow formation does not occur uniformly or monolithically. Different people react in different ways to social and cultural expectations. For some, the shadow may form from the repression of anger or aggression, while for others, it may be related to the repression of creativity, ambition, or even the desire for independence. Whatever the content of the shadow, the result is always the same. A significant part of our psyche is pushed into the unconscious, where it continues to influence our life indirectly. The shadow, though universal in its presence, is unique in its content to each individual. We do not all repress the same emotions or qualities, and this is what makes our relationship with the shadow so personal and particular. What a person represses may be related to anger or aggression, especially if they have grown up in an environment where expressing such emotions was considered dangerous or inappropriate. These people learn to bury their anger, perhaps because they were taught that aggression is unacceptable or undignified. Thus, the shadow in this case becomes an accumulation of unexpressed anger that, though invisible on the surface, is still present in the unconscious, ready to manifest itself at unexpected moments. For others, however, the shadow may be made up of more positive, but equally repressed, aspects such as creativity, ambition, or the desire for independence. In societies or families that value conformity and humility over self-expression, a person may learn to bury their creativity because they fear that being different or standing out will attract judgment or rejection. Others may repress their ambition or desire to stand out for fear of standing out too much and being criticized or rejected by those who prefer mediocrity to excellence. In these cases, the shadow is not only a place where the negative aspects of the personality are stored, but also the brighter, more powerful aspects that for cultural or family reasons have been pushed out of consciousness. Despite the differences in the content of the shadow, the result is always the same. A significant part of our psyche is pushed into the unconscious, and even though we don't see it, it continues to influence our lives indirectly. Repressed emotions, buried desires, and denied impulses don't just go away because we choose to ignore them. They continue to be present, shaping our decisions, our relationships, and our way of seeing the world. These parts of ourselves, although invisible, are still active, and they seek ways to manifest themselves indirectly. The shadow, then, becomes a force that operates from the shadows, affecting our daily lives without us realizing its true nature. This is why integrating the shadow is so crucial to our well-being. By learning to recognize and accept these repressed parts, we begin to heal the internal divisions that have been influencing our lives without our conscious knowledge. Every time we integrate a part of our shadow, we are reclaiming a part of ourselves that we had lost, and in doing so, we become more whole and authentic. The shadow is not our enemy. It is a vital part of our identity that, once integrated, can offer us a source of strength, creativity, and wisdom that we had previously ignored. This cycle of repression and eventual manifestation of the shadow creates a type of internal struggle that many of us experience throughout our lives without fully understanding its origin. We find ourselves overreacting to certain situations, feeling disconnected from ourselves, or stuck in repetitive patterns of behavior that seem to have no clear solution. What is happening is that these repressed parts are trying to find a way out, to be acknowledged and reintegrated into our consciousness. Only when we begin to make the unconscious conscious, as Jung said, can we begin to heal this internal split and live in a more authentic and complete way. This cycle of repression and manifestation is, in many ways, a subtle but persistent conflict that plays out deep within our psyche. Many of us carry on this internal struggle without even realizing it exists. We experience moments of frustration, of overreactions that seem to have no logical explanation, and we find ourselves trapped in patterns that repeat themselves over and over again, despite our conscious efforts to change. We may constantly choose the same types of relationships that end in disappointment, or we may repeatedly sabotage ourselves at work, in our health, or in our personal goals. These situations can create a feeling of helplessness, as if an invisible and powerful force is steering our life in a direction we do not want to take, but we do not know how to avoid. What is actually happening is that those repressed parts of our psyche are struggling to come to the surface. The shadow, in its desire to be acknowledged, is working in the background, pushing us into situations that, while seemingly destructive, are actually designed to force us to confront what we have been avoiding. For example, when we overreact to a harmless comment, what is happening is that reaction is coming from a much deeper wound that we have tried to ignore. The shadow uses these opportunities to remind us that there are aspects of ourselves that we have not yet integrated, And until we do, they will continue to control our responses in indirect ways. This process of confronting the shadow is essential to our healing. Jung spoke of making the unconscious conscious as the path to individuation, that is, to realizing our complete, authentic selves. We cannot be full people if a part of us remains hidden in the shadows, dictating our actions from the unconscious. Only when we bring those repressed parts into the light of our consciousness can we begin to heal that internal split. It is at that moment that we begin to experience true transformation. What previously seemed like uncontrollable chaos in our lives is revealed as an opportunity for growth and self-understanding. Suddenly, situations that previously baffled and frustrated us begin to make sense, and we see that our overreactions were not the problem, but a sign that something deeper needed to be addressed. Healing this internal split is a process that doesn't happen overnight. It requires time, patience, and most of all, a willingness to face those aspects of ourselves that we have repressed for so long. However, it is a profoundly liberating process. As we integrate our shadow, we begin to live in a more authentic way, more aligned with our true essence. We are no longer stuck in repetitive patterns of self-destruction or dissatisfaction, but by making those repressed parts conscious, we take back control of our lives. This integration allows us to be who we really are, without the masks we have created to meet external expectations. We break free from the cycle of repetition and instead begin to live from a place of greater balance, self-compassion, and clarity. The shadow is not a physical place, of course, but a psychological concept that describes the parts of our psyche that we have relegated to the unconscious. These parts, even though they're out of our conscious sight, continue to influence us in ways that we often do not understand. They manifest themselves in subtle ways, in compulsive behaviors, in decisions that seem irrational, in emotions that seem to come out of nowhere. They shape our decisions, our relationships, and our perception of the world as the shadow seeks to come to light, seeks to be recognized and integrated in some way. It is like a silent force that works from the depths of our being, determining much of what we do, feel, and experience, without us even realizing its presence. Although the shadow is not a physical space that we can locate in our body or mind, its influence is as real as any tangible force we can experience. It is a psychological concept, but one with palpable effects on our daily lives. The shadow is that set of emotions, thoughts, desires, and aspects of our personality that we have pushed out of awareness because we consider them inappropriate, shameful, or dangerous. These parts don't just go away because we ignore them. They're still there, influencing our behavior in ways we often cannot understand at the time. Sometimes the shadow manifests itself in subtle ways, such as in those moments when we make decisions that don't seem to make sense, or when we find ourselves repeating patterns that we know are not in our best interest. We may have made a conscious effort to avoid certain emotions or behaviors, but the shadow is cunning. It seeks to come to light in any way possible, even if that means manifesting itself through compulsive behaviors that we cannot rationally explain. Why do we continue to procrastinate on important projects despite knowing that doing so is harmful to us? Why are we drawn again and again to relationships that end in pain? Why do we experience waves of sadness or anger that seem to have no clear cause? The answer to all of these questions, in large part, lies in the shadow. These manifestations are attempts by our psyche to integrate what we have rejected, to bring those repressed parts to the surface so that they can finally be processed and acknowledged. The shadow, when not consciously integrated, acts from the depths of our being, influencing our decisions without us realizing it. It is not a malicious force, but a legitimate part of ourselves that seeks to be heard. The key here is to understand that the shadow does not manifest itself to harm us, but to help us integrate all the parts of our psyche. It is like a silent force that, although acting outside of our conscious sight, determines much of what we do, feel, and experience. The more we ignore its presence, the more it tries to attract our attention, often through situations that seem to challenge or destabilize us. These manifestations are not random, but indications that something needs to be explored deeper within us. When we begin to see the shadow not as an enemy, but as a part of us that seeks to be integrated, we can begin to change our relationship with it. Instead of running away from those uncomfortable emotions or destructive patterns, we can begin to dig into what they are really trying to tell us. The shadow wants to be seen, it wants to be acknowledged, and when we do, its influence stops being chaotic and destructive. Instead, it becomes a source of wisdom and self-knowledge that allows us to live with greater authenticity and balance. Integrating the shadow not only frees us from compulsive and irrational patterns, but it also helps us live from a place of greater awareness, where all the parts of us, both those we consider good and those we have labeled as bad, can coexist in harmony. We can repress our shadow for years, even decades, but sooner or later it will find a way to surface. And it will do so in ways that are often incomprehensible and disconcerting to us. Perhaps we have noticed that we react disproportionately to certain comments or situations. Maybe we have felt irritation or anger that seems exaggerated for the context in which we find ourselves. Or perhaps we have experienced deep discomfort in our relationships, as if something about the other person bothers us more than it should, as if there is an invisible trigger that leads to frustration, anxiety, or rejection. These disproportionate reactions are, in fact, signs that the shadow is emerging, that those parts of us that we have repressed for so long are desperately seeking to come to light and be recognized. The shadow is a persistent, silent, but powerful presence that cannot be contained indefinitely. Although we may spend years, even decades, repressing it, it will eventually find an outlet. We may not realize it at the time, but when we overreact to a trivial comment or feel unbridled anger at seemingly insignificant situations, what is really happening is that those repressed parts of our psyche are seeking release. Those overwhelming emotions that seem to make no sense within the context of the present situation are actually manifestations of our shadow, which has been patiently waiting for its chance to come to light. These manifestations are not limited to anger or irritation alone. They can also appear as a persistent feeling of unease in our relationships, a discomfort that we cannot rationally explain. It is as if something in the other person activates an invisible trigger inside us, leading us to feel frustration, anxiety, or even rejection. What we are experiencing in these cases is not a direct reflection of the external situation, but a projection of those repressed parts of ourselves that are desperately seeking to be acknowledged. Perhaps the other person is embodying qualities that we have learned to reject in ourselves, and that projection is our shadow's way of trying to make us aware of what we have been avoiding. These overreactions are clear signs that something deeper is going on inside us. They are reminders that there are parts of us that need to be acknowledged, that have been ignored for too long and are now seeking to surface. When we find ourselves in situations where our emotions seem exaggerated in relation to external reality, we should see this as an opportunity to explore what our shadow is trying to tell us. These experiences, although uncomfortable, are invitations to delve into our own being and begin the process of integration. Accepting and acknowledging our shadow not only helps us make sense of these overreactions, but it also allows us to live with greater self-awareness and balance. When we integrate these repressed parts of our psyche, our reactions become more proportionate and our relationships more authentic. We are no longer slaves to invisible triggers that lead us to react in ways we don't understand. Instead, we begin to act from a place of greater understanding and connection with ourselves. This integration not only improves our emotional and relational lives, but it also allows us to live with a greater sense of peace and authenticity, where all parts of ourselves are seen and accepted as they are. The shadow emerges when we least expect it, and it often takes us by surprise. We find ourselves reacting in emotionally intense ways, wondering why certain situations affect us so much, why certain comments hurt us or make us deeply angry. These reactions are often disproportionate not because the external situation is really serious, but because they are touching sensitive parts of our shadow, those parts that we have tried to bury, but that continue to exist deep within our unconscious. Often, these manifestations of the shadow puzzle us. We find ourselves asking ourselves, why did I react this way? What was it that made me feel so uncomfortable or angry? And the answer, many times, is not found in the external situation itself, but in what that situation reflects about our own repressed parts. The shadow has a funny way of breaking into our lives, usually at the most unexpected times. Something seemingly trivial, like a small criticism or an ambiguous gesture, can trigger an outsized emotional reaction that leaves us confused. These reactions are not due to the event itself, but to what that event activates within us. Those parts of our psyche that we have tried to keep hidden look for any opportunity to manifest themselves. And they do so by projecting themselves into everyday situations that, on their own, would not justify such an intense reaction. By pausing to reflect, we can begin to identify that, in reality, it is not the comment or the situation that bothers us so much, but something much deeper that we carry within. Jung observed that often what infuriates, irritates, or disconcerts us in others is actually a reflection of what we have rejected in ourselves. If someone provokes an intense emotional reaction in us, that person may be displaying qualities or behaviors that we ourselves have repressed in our own shadow. This phenomenon, known as projection, is one of the most common mechanisms through which the shadow manifests itself in our daily lives. What we cannot accept in ourselves, we project onto others. What irritates us most about others often says more about us than about them. Jung called this projection. When repressed aspects of our shadow self are reflected in the behaviors or qualities of others, causing us to react intensely. For example, someone with an authoritarian personality might irritate us deeply because we unconsciously reject our own tendencies toward control or leadership. Instead of confronting these qualities in ourselves, we project them onto others, creating a strong emotional response. This mechanism is a signal that we need to take a closer look at what we've tried to hide within ourselves. Thus, the flaws we see in others are often the flaws we have hidden within ourselves. If we feel a deep aversion towards someone who seems arrogant, for example, it is possible that this arrogance is reflecting an ambition or desire for recognition that we ourselves have repressed. If we feel insecure or jealous of someone who seems confident and self-assured, it is possible that this person is freely expressing something that we have learned to hide for fear of judgment or rejection. Our shadow cast on others often confronts us with qualities we have been unable to accept in ourselves. If, for example, we find someone's arrogance unbearable, it may be that what really bothers us is our own repressed desire for recognition. Perhaps at some point in our lives we learned that standing out was dangerous or improper, and so we repress that part. The same thing happens when we feel threatened by the confidence of others. Perhaps what we are seeing in them is what we secretly long for, but have learned to suppress for fear of being judged. Projection is a powerful and at the same time insidious mechanism. It prevents us from seeing ourselves clearly and keeps us trapped in patterns of judgment and rejection of others. We distance ourselves from others because we cannot bear to see in them what we cannot accept in ourselves. And in doing so, we distance ourselves from ourselves as well, fragmenting ourselves further and further from our true essence. Projection perpetuates disconnection, both with others and with ourselves, and prevents us from living authentically and fully. Projection acts as a kind of distorting filter. We focus so much on what bothers us about others that we have a hard time seeing what it reveals about ourselves. This cycle of judgment and rejection not only isolates us from the people around us, but it also disconnects us from our true nature. As we focus on criticizing or avoiding what we don't like about others, we move further away from the opportunity to confront and reconcile with those same qualities within ourselves. The result is a sense of internal disconnection, which prevents us from living authentically in balance with all the parts of ourselves, including those we've tried to ignore. However, the shadow is not limited to just repressed emotions or qualities that we consider negative. It also contains positive aspects of our personality that we have buried out of fear, shame, or because of societal expectations. Imagine, for example, that as a child you were naturally creative, curious, or ambitious. Maybe you wanted to excel at something. Maybe you had a special talent that made you unique, but somewhere along the way someone told you that you shouldn't stand out too much, that you shouldn't make others feel bad by showing off your talents or abilities. Maybe you were taught that modesty was more valuable than self-expression, or that you should be humble and not draw too much attention to yourself. The shadow not only houses our negative or uncomfortable emotions, but also those bright parts of ourselves that we have learned to hide. Sometimes we repress our creativity, ambition, or desires to stand out, not because they are inherently bad, but because the environment in which we grew up taught us that these qualities could cause discomfort in others. Perhaps in childhood, we were made to feel that standing out was selfish or that we should not attract too much attention. Thus, we bury talents and desires that could have flourished, hiding them in the shadows for fear of rejection or criticism. This repression is not limited to just one aspect of our personality, but encompasses multiple dimensions of who we are. Creativity, ambition, the desire for recognition, the passion for something. All of these can be buried in the shadow, becoming part of that hidden territory of our psyche. The shadow, therefore, contains not only our flaws or negative aspects, but also our greatest strengths, our deepest passions, our most valuable talents that, for one reason or another, we have learned to hide. In doing so, we deprive ourselves of fundamental parts of ourselves, parts that could contribute to a fuller, more creative and meaningful life if they were allowed to come to light. By burying our talents and passions along with our darkest emotions, we create a shadow that also contains many of our strengths. This hidden part of us not only holds on to the aspects we consider undesirable, but also those that make us unique and powerful. In doing this, we deprive ourselves of the skills and drives that could give us a richer, more fulfilling life. Our shadow, then, is not only a burden, it is also an untapped source of creativity, energy, and potential waiting to be discovered and tapped into. The problem with repressing both negative and positive aspects is that we become fragmented. We disconnect from our own essence, splitting into multiple selves that fight each other, seeking to be recognized, but at the same time fearing the consequences of that revelation. We cannot live fully because we have buried fundamental parts of ourselves. Instead of expressing our authenticity, we live lives limited by fear of judgment, by shame of being too much in some way, or by other people's expectations that dictate what we should be. We live trapped in a cycle of self-deception, where we try to convince ourselves that we are okay, that we are normal, while a part of us screams to be released, to be seen, to be accepted. By repressing both the negative and the positive, we create internal conflict. Instead of being a unified whole, we split into different parts of ourselves that all compete for recognition. This results in us never being able to live authentically, always limited by fear of judgment or disapproval. We try to project an image of normality and acceptance, but deep down, a part of us is still screaming to be heard. That internal fragmentation prevents us from experiencing true freedom, trapping us in a cycle where we never feel completely comfortable in our own skin. Far from being something passive that simply disappears over time or fades away if we deliberately ignore it, the shadow acts in a much more complex and subversive way. It feeds on repression, becoming stronger and more strategic. If we do not consciously confront it, it can come to exert considerable control over our lives, influencing our decisions without us realizing it. The shadow does not fade away on its own. By ignoring it, we strengthen it, allowing it to influence our daily lives from the shadows. What we think we have controlled reappears in unexpected ways, forcing us to confront what we have repressed. The sooner we accept its existence and integrate it, the freer we will be. Its influence manifests itself in subtle ways, such as compulsive patterns, irrational decisions, or intense emotions that seem to emerge from nowhere. The shadow acts as an underground force that, despite being out of our conscious sight, has a significant impact on our lives. Automatic behaviors and unexplained emotional reactions are clear signs of the shadow at work. Although it seems invisible, its influence is undeniable and profound, shaping our habits and relationships. We realize that something is out of our control when we keep making decisions that harm us. This hidden part of us, not having been recognized, seeks to express itself even in destructive ways. This internal sabotage is the shadow's way of screaming for attention. When we stop ignoring it, we can begin to make conscious, constructive choices rather than falling into self-destructive cycles. Instead of simply disappearing, the shadow becomes stronger the more we try to ignore it. Eventually, its manifestation will be inevitable and can be chaotic if we are not prepared to consciously confront it. The shadow is not something we can simply leave behind. As long as we repress it, it will grow in power, and when it manifests, it can do so in destructive ways. It is best to address it intentionally before it overtakes us. The only way to free ourselves from its influence is to become conscious of it, recognizing those repressed aspects in order to integrate them into our lives in a healthy way. This requires courage, but it is a path to a more balanced and authentic life. The path to emotional and psychological freedom begins with recognizing the shadow. Accepting and working with it, rather than fighting it, leads us to live more fully and authentically without the tensions of repression. The process of integrating the shadow is challenging, but it allows us to be more authentic and live without the layers of self-deception. In doing so, we discover a source of power and wisdom that strengthens and liberates us. Integrating the shadow is transformative. It brings us back into connection with our true strengths, making us more complete. The result is a life of greater freedom, authenticity, and fulfillment.